Praise be Jesus and Mary. As we begin the Easter Triduum, the solemn celebration of the Paschal mystery, our Lord's passion, death, and resurrection, the whole redemption, we today reflect on three major points that occurred on this day. Of course, we all are familiar with the Last Supper, which is precisely what we commemorate today, and the institution of the Eucharist, the sacrament of the Eucharist, which is the very sacrifice of our Lord on the cross in the unbloody manner, perpetuated to the end of time. And we will reflect on that a little bit as reflected in the first reading. We also celebrate the institution of the priesthood, which occurred when our Lord pronounced the words, "Do this in memory of me." He gave the command to the apostles when he instituted the Eucharist. Thus instituting the priesthood, also exemplified, as we will soon reflect on this a little bit, in the gospel passage we just heard of the washing of the feet. And the other thing we celebrate, the other element which you do not see here in the readings today, but is still part of what occurred today, is the new covenant of love. And in a certain sense, it is in those, and it is in the second reading. We'll see that in just a moment too. I want to reflect on those three elements, which is what we celebrate today, and have very intense meaning for all of us. First of all, of course, the institution of the Eucharist, that we see exemplified in the second reading, but also in the first. Because the first reading is, of course, is described for us what is about to occur in Egypt, as the Israelites are about to leave Egypt. And that is why our Lord has them, why God has them prepared to leave, as if in flight, because in fact, very shortly after they celebrated the Passover, which is what they were celebrating, that's what God was instituting at that point. Passover, because the angel of death would pass over the houses of the Israelites, marked with the blood of the Lamb, all symbolizing the reality that is about to take place, that we will be celebrating in particular tomorrow, with the passion and death of our Lord. But already comes out in today's celebration as well. That's the Eucharist. And so we'll note a few key points here to understand. Right? The Israelites are now ready to leave. And that is how they have to celebrate. They have to slaughter the lamb, and then take the blood and mark the doorposts and the lintels. And that's the sign for the angel of death. And he will pass over their house when he takes the lives of all the other firstborn in Egypt. It is also the symbol, as I said, of the very passion and death of our Lord. There's the reality. Christ himself is the lamb, the victim that is slaughtered. Christ himself, it is his blood that is shed. It is the sacrifice, the very sacrifice of the cross. And that sacrifice required the shedding of blood, as was that the case in the Passover, and all of the other sacrifices the Israelites will offer wandering through the desert. None of those, though, can forgive sins. None of those forgave sins. They were all symbolic. But the sacrifice of our Lord does forgive sins. Here is the reality, symbolized by what we see in the actual Passover, recorded in the first reading. We heard from the book of Exodus. The passion of death itself of our Lord, the reality that does forgive sins. And makes possible. It's not the institution of sacrament of penance, that will come after the resurrection. But it makes it possible. It's by the merits of the shedding of his blood, the sacrifice. And that's exactly, the Eucharist itself is, as I said earlier, the very same sacrifice of our Lord on the cross. It is that sacrifice. The sacrifice of the Mass is the sacrifice of our Lord on Calvary, perpetuated till the end of time. As we say, in the unbloody manner, but it's still a sacrifice, the same sacrifice. It's still the same shedding of blood represented by the separate consecrations of of the host and the wine, indicating the blood separated from the body. You see? And so thus we have what we see here in the institution of the Eucharist and the very sacrifice of our Lord on the cross. Now, the institution of the priesthood. As I said, that actually occurred when our Lord pronounced the word, "Do this in memory of me." Or as it is quoted here, "As often as you..." No. Yep, "Do this as you drink it in remembrance of me. Do this in remembrance of me." When the priest consecrates the precious body and the precious blood of our Lord in the Mass, he's offering the very same sacrifice. It's actually Christ offering through the priest. But that's the command that God gave the apostles, our Lord gave the apostles. Do this in memory of me. There was the actual institution of the priesthood. Also reflected a little bit in the washing of the feet. Now let's look at those circumstances a little bit, then we'll understand what is happening here. Evidently, when the disciples prepared the Passover, they were in a bit of a hurry, and the apostles all arrived, but they had not yet time to wash feet. Generally, when you went into somebody's house, and they were in a guest house, they were not in their own, there would be a servant outside the door as you approach the door with a basin of water, and they would wash the feet of the ones coming in, of the guests. Evidently, this had not occurred with the apostles. They were rushing, they began the supper without washing their feet. Now it came to the point where they must have been discussing, okay, who's going to wash our feet? Who's going to play the servant and wash the feet? And who gets up? But our Lord himself, the Master. He does he washes their feet. And he tells them, what you understand, what I'm doing now, you don't fully understand, but you will later. And what I do now, you will do. What does he say? All right, there. If therefore the Master and Teacher have washed your feet, if I therefore the Master and Teacher have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. What is he saying here? If he is the Master, he is also the servant. He is serving. The ministerial priesthood is a ministry. That's why it's called ministry. It means service. It's serving. And here it is, our Lord himself, the Master. So the higher the responsibility, even though he's the Master, he's still serving. He's a servant. He's making himself the servant. And he's saying, that's what you all have to do too. That's what we have to do as well. Serve. Right? And so here, that's what he's pointing towards with this move. It's a move, it's an act of service. And it's an act of humility, of course. Here, okay, once we see, well, I have all this high responsibility. I'm a high up. I'm a big man. Right? I'm the dictator, whatever. I'm really high up. But that doesn't mean then you just lord it over. Actually, our Lord makes that point elsewhere in the Gospel. No, it's not something to lord over, to dominate. No, it is an act of service. Your life is a ministry of service. It's service. Right? We might point out one of the titles of even the Pope, the Vicar of Christ. One of his titles is the servant of the servants of God. So the higher up the responsibility, the more you are called to serve. And that's the point our Lord is making here. And then finally, the new covenant of love. Right, mentioned here a little bit because he calls let me see. Well, anyway, it's in the Eucharist because he calls it the new covenant in his blood. There's the covenant, which means the agreement, and that's the agreement between God and all the rest of us, his people. He will be our God, we will be his people. We will serve him, we will follow him, give ourselves to him. He will guard us, watch over us, take care of us. But we must give ourselves to him. But another point that our Lord also here issues the new covenant of love, but he does it actually after the Last Supper as they're on their way to Gethsemane, which we also celebrate as we make the final procession with our Eucharist to the altar of repose. That actually was what that represents. Going out to the garden and the arrest of our Lord outside the garden. And the beginning of his passion and death. And that's why we leave in the inside, the sanctuary will be left completely bare, stripped, dark. You see, and so you hear no more bells until the glory of Easter Vigil. The somberness of the moment. Now, the great mystery, the greatest sign of love is to come to pass. That our Lord lays down his life for all of us. And he tells his disciples, one of the things he says, you can find it in the long discourse of our Lord after the Last Supper. There it spans 3 chapters, from chapter 15 through 17 of John's Gospel. But part of that is issuing that new commandment of love, as he calls it. Love one another as I have loved you. And that's where he also gives that great phrase, no greater love has a man than that he lay down his life for his friends. And here, and our Lord gives the first one to give the example. He lays down his life willingly. Lays down his life, not only for his friends, but for his enemies, for everyone, anyone and everyone who will come to him. It will require sacrifice. It's an act of conversion, turning around from the way of sin and darkness, symbolized by the whole season of Lent. Sin, darkness, evil, all of the filth. Turn away and turn back to God, source of all light, all grace, the source of our salvation. And turn back to him in all love and give back to him as little as we can, as best we can. The love, our love to him for all the great love he already gives us. Praise be Jesus and Mary.